Good afternoon. I am not Connie Ryan, but I am here on behalf of the Interfaith Alliance of Iowa to say welcome. We're thrilled that you ventured out. We're tough Iowegians, we can do this. For those of you online, lucky you. It's a little messy here today. We're thrilled to be able to talk about water quality. Certainly a topic that is uppermost in the minds of all of us, both nationally and on the state level. We're thankful that there are watchers of our water quality. I would include Todd Dorman among them, frankly, but yes, let's clap for Todd Dorman. But really and truly, the Iowa Environmental Council, which will be celebrating its 30th year this year, is at the top of the list. And how fortunate we are to have Michael Schmidt, to talk about the drinking water and how to protect drinking water in Iowa. Michael joined the Iowa Environmental Council in 2019. And he works across the program areas of the council. He previously was staff attorney for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, where he focused on clean water and mining issues through enforcement, permitting, and rulemaking actions. He previously worked for the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, which is a state-based nonprofit. And there he engaged in legal, legislative, and policy advocacy on water quality issues. So this is the guy we want in our corner when it comes to talking about water. He has a law degree from the University of Minnesota and a BA in political science from the University of Iowa. Yes, he has dual citizenship. So we're thrilled to welcome Michael Schmidt, and the format for today, he will talk, and his presentation will go for approximately 30 minutes, and then we will take questions. Because of our current setup, there won't be anyone walking around with a microphone, so we will need you, if you do have a question, to come to the front of the room. And I would ask that you stay in this area. We can't cross the red tape. So stay in this area, queue up, ask your question, and then depart. So thank you all. Michael Schmidt, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me this afternoon. I'm here to talk about water quality. You already heard about me, so I'll just move on. Today, I'll give you a little bit of background about the Iowa Environmental Council, and then I will turn to some water issues in Iowa and what we are doing with it in terms of a petition that we filed last year, and then next steps and what you all can do to help with water quality in the state. So the Iowa Environmental Council is the state's largest environmental nonprofit coalition. We have about 100 member organizations and hundreds of individual members. So we work together with those coalition members to make progress on environmental issues, mostly at the state level. Our mission is to create a just, healthy environment and a sustainable future for all Iowans. And to do that, we have a number of priority issues. Those include climate change, which affects all of the environment and all the things we do. We also recognize that the effects of environmental impacts are not felt equally for all people, so we work on environmental justice. We work to advance clean energy, to mitigate climate impacts, and of course, we work on water and land stewardship, which is what I'll be focusing on today. Our focus is also on the state level. We do a lot at the legislature. We do work at the agency administrative level. When it's appropriate, we also work at the local level, especially if it will have a statewide impact or a larger impact. And when it's useful, we work at the federal level. So thinking about the Safe Drinking Water Act and the impact of drinking water on Iowans, The Safe Drinking Water Act is different from the Clean Water Act. I think that's what a lot of folks think about when you think about clean water. The Clean Water Act restricts discharges to surface waters. There we go. Clean Water Act restricts discharges to surface waters. So you can't have a pipe coming out of your industry and send pollution into the river unless you have a permit saying, here's how much you can pollute that river. So it's basically a license to pollute surface water. It does not apply to groundwater, does not control what comes out of your tap. The Safe Drinking Water Act gets to that a little bit more. In 1974, it was passed and it focused on what is coming out of the drinking water treatment facilities. So how clean does that water have to be coming out of the facility? And also, how clean is it at your tap? It has expanded in scope to include underground sources of drinking water. So instead of just saying you can have any quality of water going into the treatment plant, maybe we should protect it upstream so that we don't have to treat as much and have people pay for that treatment. We should prevent that pollution in the first place. So the regulations in the Safe Drinking Water Act apply to public water supplies. So anybody here live in the city of Cedar Rapids? Many of you? Okay. So you get your water from a public water supply. It supplies more than 25 people. Even if it was just the people in this room, it's more than 25 people. So the public water supplier has to meet specific standards, maximum contaminant levels that cannot be exceeded. There can also be goals that are not enforceable for things like lead, because no amount of lead is safe to consume, but we recognize it's not always feasible to have zero of something. So it's a goal, but you don't actually have to get there. For the maximum contaminant levels, it is a hard limit. So if somebody exceeds a maximum contaminant level after they've treated the water, then they have to notify residents about that. So you might get a letter saying, just so you know, we have exceeded the standard for, say, nitrate. So speaking of nitrate, we do have a maximum contaminant level, and it's 10 milligrams per liter, also calculated as parts per million. So the nitrate standard is based on protecting against acute effects, so the effects that you can see pretty quickly after you ingest it. That means basically babies who drink formula made with water that has high nitrate can have a case called blue baby syndrome, where they turn a little bit blue because they don't get enough oxygen in their blood. The nitrate essentially replaces the oxygen. That's obviously not what we want, so EPA has a standard saying you can't exceed that. It does not have a standard, though, that addresses long-term chronic effects. Those are much harder to identify because it's not like you drink the water and then the next day you have cancer. But if you look at long-term studies of tens of thousands of people over decades, you can tease apart the interactions between high nitrate in drinking water and those health effects down the road. Iowa is one of those places where we've been able to do that. We have high nitrate, we have some of those long-term studies, and that has found correlation between high nitrate and health effects. And it's not just correlation, we also have an understanding of the causation, at least for some of these. For things like cancer, we know that nitrate gets reduced in our digestive system to nitrate. Nitrate has its own maximum contaminant level that's 1/10 of nitrate. And then that gets converted into other compounds that can cause tumors. So we have an idea of how this happens, and then we have this data showing if you drink high levels of nitrate for a long time, there are consequences in the forms of different kinds of cancer. I'm sure folks are aware that we have a high cancer rate in Iowa, the second highest in the country, and it's rising. We're one of only a couple of states where it's rising. So there might be some relationship between our high nitrate levels and those health effects on the other side. It can also contribute to birth defects. So those include neural tube defects, things where the nervous system is not fully enclosed in the spinal cord, things like spina bifida. So we have both kind of shorter term effects on, shorter term effects on babies, potential effects on people who might be giving birth, so young adults, and those long-term effects on older adults. And I'm sure a lot of you have anecdotal evidence of this kind of effect. I know I've had a lot of relatives lately diagnosed with cancer. I had a cousin with spina bifida, which is a neural tube defect. So at least anecdotally, this lines up with my experience and with that larger data set. So it can affect everybody across the spectrum, across Iowa. If you would like to know more, I encourage you to check out the nitrate health report that IAC put out last year. It summarizes the scientific data. We had some expert reviewers look at what does the collection of scientific data show about the relationship of nitrate and health effects. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So thinking about the potential effects in a specific area, one area that we're especially concerned about is in northeast Iowa with karst terrain. Are folks familiar with karst terrain and northeast Iowa? Some yes, some no. Okay. So karst terrain is an area where you have limestone bedrock that is pretty close to the surface. You don't have a deep soil profile like you have in some parts of the state. You might have 20 inches of soil, and below that you have bedrock, and it's limestone, which means it often has caves or sinkholes. Water has poured through that, and now you have these openings where you have a close connection between the surface and underground. And that means water can pretty quickly get from the surface, from rain, maybe on farmland, into the underground aquifers. This creates a problem if we are putting a lot of stuff on the surface of the land that can get into the aquifers. And unfortunately, that is what we see. This map shows the number of concentrated animal feeding operations in northeast Iowa. So we have about 989 in these 12 counties that are registered with DNR. That's about 1 million animal units. So an animal unit is one beef cow or its manure equivalent. So it's 2.5 pigs or something, a huge number of chickens because they don't produce quite as much. So we have a lot of manure being generated here. We also have a lot more row crop land than we used to. And so the manure gets placed on this row crop land without any treatment. It's just held for a while and then spread on the land without any treatment. So if you think about all that manure, a lot of which is liquid manure, most of the animal feeding operations here are swine operations that produce liquid manure, that can just go down into the soil. And we already talked about how there's not that much soil, and below that is this porous limestone connected to groundwater and aquifers, which creates some problems for us. So fortunately, a lot of folks out here who have private wells can use a testing program that Iowa set up under our 1987 Groundwater Protection Act. Now that Groundwater Protection Act said it was of paramount importance to prevent contamination of our drinking water sources, our groundwater. It did not actually provide regulations to prevent that contamination, but obviously it's important not to contaminate it. So folks can test their wells to see if their groundwater is contaminated. Not every county actually uses the money that gets allocated to them, so sometimes it gets reallocated to the counties that do use it, and we end up with thousands of people testing their wells every year. So out of the 4,000 odd people who test their wells every year, any guesses as to what percentage of wells that is in the state?
80? Less than 1%.
It's about 5%. So we get a slice of data, but it's not at all comprehensive. And it's not always a different 5%. So some people might test every year. There are recommendations to test every year. But some people test once and then they think, oh, I'm fine. Or they test once and think, oh, well, I don't want to find out exactly what is wrong with my water. I've heard from folks who don't do any tests because they can't afford to do the upgrades that would be needed if they find out that their water is not clean. So for the folks on private wells, they can have problems and there's not a system set up to provide clean water for them. So it's very different from the public water supplies where the city of Cedar Rapids has to meet some fixed standards, and if they don't, they have to tell people, and if they don't, they also have to fix their treatment system or provide some way to get clean water to people. Private wells don't operate that way. It's a very different system. And unfortunately, what we see is a lot are contaminated. So since 1989, when we've had this testing program in place and operating, we've had thousands of private well tests in Northeast Iowa. And a lot of them, every red dot on here is a test that is above 10 milligrams per liter, that drinking water standard. We have some that are fine. Some wells might be deeper, they might be in a different area that's not affected by those pollution sources on the surface, but a lot are not clean. And looking at the actual numbers per county in recent years, we have more than 1,000 tests above 10 milligrams per liter. We actually have more than 1,000 wells above 10 milligrams per liter. It's 5,000 some tests. So some people have tested multiple times and found their well is, yes, still contaminated. And some have tested once and then not again. So we have a lot of wells that are exceeding this drinking water standard. And it is disproportionately in Northeast Iowa where we have this close connection to surface water and groundwater, which makes sense, even though we have less agriculture or less intensive agriculture there than in some other parts of the state. So there's almost a third of wells in this area that are above 5 milligrams per liter. And I didn't mention it very explicitly before, but that 10 milligram per liter is the acute standard. And for those chronic effects, those have been found at 5 milligrams per liter and 3 and 2. So even at 5 milligrams per liter, you can have some health effects potentially based on those studies of Iowans. So this doesn't just affect private wells, it also affects public water supplies. Strawberry Point in Northeast Iowa retired a well because, as you can see on this chart, it was close to 10 milligrams per liter most of the time. So they would blend it with other wells to get the level down, but they realized this is not a long-term solution, so they retired that well and they paid to dig a deeper well. So even public water supplies are seeing issues with their underground sources of drinking water. Given all these problems, what do we do? The Clean Water Act doesn't address this. The Safe Drinking Water Act doesn't regulate these private wells. There's no funding for this. We need somebody else to step in because the state is not acting. The state provides the testing, but not the follow-up that's necessary for these folks. So we petitioned EPA. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, EPA has emergency powers under Section 1431. And these emergency powers allow EPA to come in and take action where the state is not doing enough. This is what the EPA used in Flint, Michigan. Folks might remember that in Flint, they changed the water source, they changed the treatment process to try to save money because the city, I think, was bankrupt. So they changed the process, and it turned out that started leaching lead out of their pipes. And EPA intervened and said, we have to provide clean drinking water, we need to stop this process, we need to undo it. And they used this section of law to be able to do that. In Iowa, the state has delegated authority to implement the Safe Drinking Water Act, but that doesn't prevent EPA from coming in when it really needs to do that. So under Section 1431, EPA has to get information about contamination that can lead to substantial endangerment. So there are some specific terms on here, so we'll break this down. Information is not the same as evidence, so you don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt or even a preponderance of the evidence. So from a legal perspective, that's helpful because we don't have to make our whole case, we just have to provide information to EPA that we have a problem here. You have to have a contaminant, and obviously nitrate is one. We have a maximum contaminant level. We have evidence of the health impacts of ingesting nitrate. We also have an underground source of drinking water. These are private wells that we've been talking about, and even aquifers that cities like Strawberry Point have been drawing on that are contaminated. So we have clearly underground sources of drinking water that do or could serve public water supplies. And then the more complicated term here is imminent and substantial endangerment. So imminent doesn't mean it's happening tomorrow, it just means the conditions are present where it can lead to that harm down the road. Substantial means a lot. I think based on those well tests, we know that there are a lot of people being affected by this, because that list of 1,200 people or 1,200 wells means even more people than that. And that's only this slice of the total wells in the area. So we have a lot of folks who might be at risk here. And then the endangerment is that long-term, the potential harm and substantial cancer and these other health problems are significant. So after the Flint crisis, EPA issued a guidance memo and basically said, we should be using this authority more. We shouldn't wait until people are being poisoned by lead. We should be more proactive about this, intervene sooner. This memo came out in 2018, so it was under the Trump administration, where EPA said, we need to do a better job of getting ahead of this, not letting a crisis happen and then try to fix it after people are harmed. And helpfully, in this guidance, it says, there we go. It gives an example saying this guidance might be appropriate, or this action might be appropriate, where you have karst terrain and maybe there's nitrate contamination and there are sources that are not being controlled, which is precisely what we have across Iowa and particularly in Northeast Iowa. Now, DNR through all this is continuing to maintain the private well monitoring. It has grant money for some actions related to drinking water supply. There's a state revolving fund. But EPA doesn't have to make an affirmative finding that the state has failed. EPA can still intervene even if the state is doing some things, which is maybe helpful for us because DNR is doing some work on this. It's just that we aren't seeing the problem really get much better. We've had the Groundwater Protection Act in place since about the time I could walk, and we still have a problem even with those tests from the last several years. So obviously we need to be doing something different, and the state action is not enough. Other folks have tried to use this petition process or this enforcement action and asked the EPA to intervene, specifically about nitrate in underground sources of drinking water, just like EPA put in its guidance memo. The most recent one was in 2023 in Minnesota, in southeast Minnesota specifically, focused on karst terrain. So as you might guess, karst terrain does not follow political boundaries. It doesn't just stop because we decided this is where Minnesota starts. It is the same geologic formation that comes into Iowa. They have the same kinds of agriculture in Minnesota. They also have concentrated animal feeding operations and row crop agriculture that gets fertilized regularly with nitrate. And in response to the Minnesota petition, EPA responded and said, we find that there are thousands of people at risk of drinking polluted water in Minnesota, and the state needs to do more. We need additional action. And they told the state, you need to provide a plan for what to do, and you need to provide that within 30 days. So for EPA, 30 days is light speed. It's very quick. Generally, things don't happen really fast with large federal agencies, but EPA said, give us a plan in 30 days. And they responded to the petition in November of 2023. So it was filed in April, EPA responded in November. The Minnesota state agencies did come up with a plan, and they said, we'll provide clean drinking water, we will update rules, we'll take a number of actions. And they agreed basically to start work to actually address the long-term problem, not just put a Band-Aid on it by providing bottled water, which is one option in the short term. So we saw that EPA was willing to act. We have the exact same problems in Iowa. We have the same geologic formation. We have plenty of data showing that wells are polluted in Northeast Iowa in particular. So we filed our own petition. We got together with a number of other organizations, including some focused on Northeast Iowa, like Alameda County Protectors. We worked with some national groups like Food and Water Watch, who were involved in some of the prior petitions. So we got this group together, and we also petitioned EPA. We gave them the information that I presented to you, showing we have a lot of wells that are contaminated. We have this ongoing problem. The state has not fixed it. The state has known about this because leading up to the Groundwater Protection Act, there was a report saying, we've had growing nitrate pollution for 20 years, so we really need to do something about it. And then the legislature passed the Groundwater Protection Act. But that hasn't fixed the problem. Instead, we've seen this problem continue. So it's been going on since at least the 1960s, based on that report, without a solution. We asked EPA, do at least as much here as you did in Minnesota. We have the same problem, same issues, same geologic basis for this. Please do at least that much. Provide clean drinking water. Tell people about the problem, because not everybody's testing their wells. Be transparent on what's going on. Provide some reporting. And of course, start cleaning up the problem. We need long-term solutions. We don't just want bottled water that we have to pay for every year or that somebody pays for every year. We want to actually prevent the pollution, not just fix it on the other end. Beyond that, we wanted even more because Iowa doesn't have all the same regulations that Minnesota does. So we said, we need some additional steps beyond what you told the Minnesota agencies to do. We don't have a groundwater protection rule like Minnesota does. We don't have nitrogen fertilizer restrictions like Minnesota does. So please step in, address our concentrated animal feeding operations, address these other potential sources of nitrate. We need some action. So we filed our petition in April of 2024, a year after Minnesota's. Minnesota got a response in November, and we were hoping for a response in November, and we didn't get one. So what's next? We are still waiting for that response. We haven't heard when we will get one at this point. We don't know if we will get one. We don't know who at EPA is still there to be working on one. So it's kind of an open question. Is this petition actually going to get a response even close to what Minnesota got? We don't really know. So in the meantime, we are continuing to work on other approaches, including legislative work. So there are, excuse me, there are a number of things that we can do both in the legislature and outside the legislature to address this. One is to update the nutrient reduction strategy, which is officially the state policy on addressing nutrients like nitrogen. The state did just recently update it, although it was not to include a timeline or benchmarks or a specific strategy. It was instead saying, well, if we planted more than corn and soybeans, we could make a lot of progress on it, which I could have told you before they updated the strategy. But that's in there now, so I guess that's some level of progress. We also need to strengthen CAFO regulations. So all those concentrated animal feeding operations, apply their manure on the land, it can get into the water. We are exporting a huge amount of nitrate that is being applied on farmland and is not being used by crops. So we need to change that system so that we're not just sending it into the Mississippi River and the Missouri River. There are steps that we could take to strengthen water quality standards so that we actually have numbers to hit instead of not too much algae as our standard. Right now we have a narrative standard, but no numbers saying here's the number that we have to meet. Even without those numeric standards, we still have a lot of our waters impaired, not meeting the water quality standards set by the state. And there are some basic practices that every farmer, every agricultural operation should follow. Things like don't plant corn right up to the stream. We have some pictures that I did not include in this showing corn falling into a stream. That's not good for anybody. You don't want to have your own crop falling into the water. And obviously for everybody else, that doesn't help either. And there are things like watershed cleanup plans where we identify the problems, we identify what can be done, and then we tell people, well, if you want to do it, you can. But generally we don't get enough people saying, sure, I'll volunteer to do that. So our voluntary system of cooperation to achieve clean water has not worked for the last 80 years that we've been trying it. So ultimately we need to restore a better balance between the public and the environment and the interest that we all have in clean water and a healthy landscape and the agricultural, agribusiness interests in the state. For the last several decades, we've not had that balance, so we need to work to get back to that by changing our policies, including at the state legislature. So ways that you can get involved, I encourage you to sign up for our email list so that you can get involved in action alerts, talk to your legislator, get to know your legislator, talk to your local officials about what they can do. Soil and water conservation districts can take steps to clean things up. So signing up for our email list is one way to get engaged and weigh in on bills at the legislature now. I have a number of fact sheets on the table over there if anybody's interested in reading more about some of the bills that are at issue this year. And then support IEC. I guess before that, if you do sign up for our list, we send out a weekly update on what's going on at the legislature. We link to action alerts so you can weigh in on bills that are being heard very soon. And we do generally target those to folks who are considering those bills. So you're not going to get bills that are, unrelated to what your legislator can do right now. And then in the summer, we also have a weekly update showing which lakes are closed due to bacteria and harmful algae blooms. So if you're interested in going out to a lake, our website or our email is a good way to see which ones you might not want to go to. And of course, you can support IEC. We're a nonprofit, so we depend on support from individuals. And if you want us to continue our work, it helps to have support from people across the state. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Okay, the hand in the back, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Would you come to the microphone because we are broadcast live into the living rooms of thousands of people. Or we could repeat the question. Drew, come on up.
My question is, so my family has land up in northeast Iowa near like LaPorte City, and we rent it out to our cousin. Are there things that we could put in our contract with him that would be specific suggestions of like, hey, we require these specific this far away from streams, like specific suggestions for how to utilize land that you would suggest to put in a contract with a farmer for them to use your land properly in the way that you guys recommend?
Yeah, there are a number of things that apply pretty broadly. So about 58% of Iowa farmland is rented. So we have a lot of renter operators who do whatever's in their contract. And so getting stuff into the contract is a great way to increase conservation practices. So that would include things like grass waterways. Northeast Iowa tends to be pretty hilly. So having grass waterways so that you're not just eroding the soil is a good first step. There are also things like cover crops where you have crops growing outside of the time of year that you have corn or soybeans growing, which are the most common crops in the state. Cover crops are one of the things in the nutrient reduction strategy that's recommended on most of the acres that are in row crops right now. There are other things like creating wetlands. So if you have a low area, you often get less productivity from that area. And if you just stop up the tile drain or stop some water there, then the water can be held, and that holding time can lead to bacterial processes that reduce the nitrate in what comes out after it flows out. So those are a few of the steps. There are some like saturated buffers and bioreactors that are also possibilities, but those are pretty site specific, so you have to have the right slope of land to be able to use those.
Other questions? So one question that I will pose, Mike, I'm wondering if the IEC, as well as some of your partner organizations, do you do a specific lobby day in Des Moines or have statewide gatherings that allow you to go and talk to our legislators, see if we can try to move some of these issues forward?
Yes, so our lobby day was, I turned it was February 19th this year. And this picture is one from our lobby day that I took. So we invited a bunch of our member organizations to go and talk to legislators. We had a series of speakers talking about the issues that we're working on and things that they're concerned about. So we'll do that next year. And if you sign up for our list, then you'll get emails about getting involved in that for next year.
And when Mike and I were talking earlier, I did ask the question about the funding of the IEC, and he had talked about how much grant funding the IEC gets, and naturally there's federal funding that the IEC gets, and that is in jeopardy. And if it's kosher for you to talk a little bit more about your grant funding?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, so starting last year, we started getting federal funding through EPA primarily. We had applied for some grants, or we were sub-awardees on grants. So there's one through the state of Iowa, where we are helping the state carry out some objectives. One of our grants has been terminated that we were a sub-awardee on. So that is affecting our funding this year. And then there are other grants that are not terminated at this point, but we don't know what will happen with them. Federal funding is fortunately not the primary source of income for the organization. We rely on other foundation grants and individual donations as well.
We're doing a lot of community organizing in this area right now, and any of you who want to be involved in that, we'll have a little thing over here. St. Paul's and League of Women Voters are doing some of these things too, and that's going out and talking to people. So you can talk to legislators, but a lot of times their hands are tied if they have this as an issue. It has to come from more pressure of voting and from people knowing, like a lot of things I learned today, even though I know about some water quality things. So what is it that we can do as individuals and as like this whole group of people, if we all went and talked to 10 people about what we learned, and like I have a family farm, how could that impact? So what would be your strategies from Iowa Environmental Council for organizing people and like the information to get the like concise facts out to people?
Yeah, so as an organization, we do a lot of education, outreach, and organizing. So we have campaigns around some specific things like cleaning up Iowa's coal plants. So unrelated to what I talked about today, but Iowa has 6 coal plants that continue to operate and are owned by Mid-American and Alliant Energy. So there are things that we are specifically organizing around for that, for water and other legislative issues. Getting engaged in groups like League of Women Voters or IEC's other member organizations is a good way to build those connections across groups and with other individuals who care about these things, so that we're not just talking about it in a vacuum or one-on-one, but instead are working more cohesively. And part of IEC's mission is to bring together all these groups, all these different people with slightly different interests or focus areas, so that we are more coordinated. So we do things like a legislative roundtable where we bring together all of our different groups who want to work on legislative issues, and we talk about what's coming up next week, what happened this week, how can we be strategic about engaging on things so that we can be more effective as a whole, not just, all working separately in parallel and duplicating efforts. So engaging with other organizations and IEC, I think, is a way to help align everybody's work without duplicating it at the same time.
So one of the things you mentioned was what happens downstream, specifically in the Gulf of Mexico. Gracias. So I'm curious if there have been lawsuits or particular pressure from our neighbors downstream to get us to stop doing what we are doing upstream.
Yeah, so short answer is yes, but not lately. Iowa Environmental Council and the place I worked at the time, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, were plaintiffs in a lawsuit against EPA for failure to address the Gulf dead zone issues. EPA has had a task force to address the hypoxic zone, the area with low oxygen that results from high nitrate in the Gulf for more than 25 years, I think. They keep setting goals and they keep moving those goals out farther as we keep not meeting them. So this lawsuit was for EPA to actually do something, set limits for states to meet as it did in the Chesapeake Bay, or set standards for every state to meet so that every state has numeric standards instead of those not too much algae kind of standard. And EPA denied that request, that petition, so we sued about it and ultimately lost that lawsuit. It went up to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they rejected the idea that EPA had to act on it. They said the EPA had enough rationale to deny it, so that's the last that I've heard about it. There is an ability for states downstream to sue for upstream pollution. That has happened in other places, but Louisiana has not been at all interested in suing Iowa. Louisiana has its own pollution to the Mississippi River and the Gulf, which might be part of it. Politics might be part of it. So they've been unwilling to do that. And that kind of a lawsuit by private parties like fishing organizations in the Gulf, I think would be a heavy lift and hard to target specific defendants to go after, because they can't just sue a state. A state can sue a state, but you can't have, the fishery organization for the Gulf sue Iowa.
Alan?
We have to come up here and.
Yes, sir, right there. Get on this side of my.
I guess my question, I've had a hard time framing this, but this is Iowa. Agriculture is king. So we could talk about this and we could go all this and we can all pat each other on the backs when we leave here. We know what the problem is. Everybody knows what the problem is. And it's basically agriculture. It's livestock feeding, and yields are king. I mean, that's a fact of life. So we can talk about it, but I think it seems to me that the only way that we're going to make a lot of progress here, or make any progress, is to work the solution side. I don't see us going in and telling you can't have 3,000 more cattle on this 10 acres. That's not going to work. So somehow we have to look for solutions. We talk about cover crops and we do all of that, but once again, it comes down to the yield. How much money are you going to put into the cover crop? How is that going to impact the yields? So can we get some organizations to begin looking at solutions that are saleable in a state like Iowa? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, so the economics are very challenging for this, and it's partly because we have the Farm Bill incentivizing maximum production and incentivizing corn and soybeans at the expense of other potential crops that we could be growing. And we also have ethanol eating up the majority of the corn. So we end up with this huge market for corn and soybeans, and that's at the expense of more diverse landscapes that would have fewer externalized costs. Changing the Farm Bill and the subsidies that come along with that would be a great step. That's one of the places where we do engage in federal work, at least sometimes. The Farm Bill doesn't come up every year, but when it does come up, we do engage at that time. And yeah, it's not something that we can immediately change or change just one thing. There's not, here's this one quick thing that nobody wants to tell you about. It's that we have $1 billion in subsidies coming in. Crop insurance is subsidized. So even if you lose your crop, you will still have that insured, and most of the crop insurance is paid for through through the Farm Bill by taxpayers rather than the agricultural producers. So I agree, we need economic solutions that make sense for farmers, but to do that, we need to change the Farm Bill, we need to change the ethanol requirements, and in the meantime, what we can do at the state level is restrict some of the worst practices. So when I think about the Supreme Beef feedlot that has gotten a lot of news, the Gazette has covered that really well. That is on karst terrain, near sinkholes, upstream from one of Iowa's outstanding Iowa waters. We have about 3 dozen of those that are clean, mostly. And so we need to restrict that kind of practice. And we filed our petition because the DNR and the Environmental Protection Commission did not change those practices. We were asking for rule changes that would restrict siting like that so that we don't have these worst case scenarios. And even then, they wouldn't do it. I agree, we need bigger changes and we can work toward that. I don't know exactly what that looks like, short of change in who's writing the laws at the federal level, in particular with the Farm Bill, that is driving a lot of this policy.
How did you get the nitrogen changes in Minnesota?
So there's a question, yeah, how did you get the nitrogen changes in Minnesota? Well, I didn't do that. Yeah.
Solutions, yeah.
Yeah.
Whoever did it.
Well, so the Minnesota petition was filed to EPA Region 5, which covers the Great Lakes. Ours was filed to Region 7, which covers Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. Region 5 tends to operate a little bit differently, trying to protect the Great Lakes than Region 7 does. So that's one piece. We tried to make our petition as similar to the Minnesota petition as possible, recognizing that there's not a good reason to treat them differently than us, other than politics, I guess. So that was partly how Minnesota did it. Minnesota also has agriculture, but it doesn't just have agriculture. Northern Minnesota has a lot of untouched areas like boundary waters. They have a lot more lakes. It was interesting moving from Minnesota to Iowa because of the culture shift in how people view the outdoors, the environment, because folks who have lived in Minnesota for generations have a lake cabin somewhere. It was their grandma's cabin or something like that, and they go there every summer. And we don't have that for the most part in Iowa. Ultimately, I think Minnesota is in a very different place in terms of environmental concern than we are in Iowa, because we don't have the same resources today that Minnesota has, and we've lost the ones that we used to have.
I would think one simple way for us to do something about this is to quit eating so much meat. If you look at the number of vegetarian boxes that are out here, it's a lot smaller than the meat boxes, okay? It just seems like if we could reduce the demand for this stuff, it would go down. And it's something, you can eat vegetarian and still lead a healthy life. Ask Libby, because I'm a vegetarian. You don't have to quit eating meat, but you can start eating less meat. And, if these people are doing this because you want it, they're going to keep doing it as long as, we keep doing it.
Yeah, and to build off that, there's been a huge consolidation in the meat industry and a lot of other industries. I recommend the book Barons by Austin Frerick, if you want to learn more about that. So we end up with almost all of the hogs in Iowa being owned by one of a few corporations, and all of the slaughterhouses are owned by one of a few corporations, and almost all of the pork and beef is grown in large scale confinement, or at least concentrated operations. They're not always totally covered 100%, which makes them not a confinement under state law. So even if the animals can stick their heads out, basically, then it's not considered a confinement. Then it's just an open feedlot, which is what Supreme Beef is categorized as. So, yeah, reducing your meat consumption is one way to address it. again, it's not a total solution, but that has a lot of benefits from a climate standpoint as well.
Yes.
Is there any piece of legislation right now that's still alive that you would recommend we lobby for?
The question is there any piece of legislation that's still alive that Mike would recommend that we lobby for? And it looks like our own representative, Senator Art, do you have an answer to that too? And maybe if you would come up here, Art, because people would want to see you and hear you. And while Art's coming up, I'll remind you that our next intersections is April the 4th, and the topic is food insecurity. Our speaker will be Clint Tweetball from Matthew 25. So now Senator Art State.
Every year in the legislature, there are bills that are written legislation. I write several every year. I have the CAFO moratorium and water quality bill this year, but it's been funnel week. So if it doesn't come out of the committee today, it's dead. So those bills are dead. I'm interested in what the strategy is with the Environmental Council on talking to legislators, particularly chairs, when these bills are in their committees early in the session. What the strategy is for moving those.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, we do try to engage on a wide number of bills, but we have limited capacity to do that as a nonprofit with limited staff and a legal limit on how much lobbying we can do. So we engage with the committee chairs to the extent that we can on particularly water issues and energy issues. This year, we have been supportive of a natural infrastructure bill, Senate File 3 and House Study Bill 83, which would allow counties and as amended counties and cities to invest in natural infrastructure like floodplain restoration and oxbow construction or reconstruction rather than just gray infrastructure like flood walls. So if we do those kinds of things upstream, it reduces the flooding downstream and increases the habitat and other environmental benefits. So that's one bill that we've been working on. I think that might be folded into the governor's natural hazard mitigation bill. I don't know if that's the exact name for it. Another bill that we have been supporting this year relates to lead service lines and disclosure of lead service lines. I didn't get into that aspect, but that's something else we've been working on. So there's a bill that would require disclosure of lead service lines on property transfer if the owner knows that there is a lead service line, because that sale period is the time when you could probably figure out the payment to be able to cover a lead service line replacement. There has been federal money to replace those, but that is kind of in question at this point. So there needs to be some other way to address them long term. So those are a couple of bills that we have been supportive of this year. And then in terms of engagement with the chairs of committees, it's a challenge because there are not a lot of bills that we have been supportive of, and so that are likely to move through anywhere. So we try to target the ones that we think have a chance and where we think that we can make a difference in working with the legislators. Yeah, so a bill that we have been objecting to this year relates to pesticide immunity for manufacturers, also called the Cancer Gag Act. That's one where it would say that the label on a pesticide, as long as the manufacturer applies the EPA label, they are immune from any subsequent claims of failure to warn the users about problems that result from using the pesticide. That has passed through committee in the Senate. It passed the full Senate last year with 30 votes. It has not been introduced in the House, so I think there's a decent chance that it doesn't move, but we'll see.
Yes.
Could you speak to tiling on farmland?
The question is, can you speak to the topic of tiling on farmland?
I would be happy to. One of the first things I did at the Iowa Environmental Council was a research project on drainage law in Iowa. It's still online, so if you would like to read Modernizing Iowa Drainage Law, have at it. One of the things I learned is that Iowa drainage law is similar in many ways from what it was a century ago. There is still law from, I think it was 1919 that I found that was still in place when I did the report in 2020. It's also codified in our Constitution that we should be draining land. As a result of this, Iowa has about 13.5 million acres that is tile drained based on the ag census. So that's roughly a third of Iowa. There are some counties that have more than 70% of the total area in the county tile drained, particularly in north central Iowa, the Des Moines lobe. What that does is basically put a plumbing system in farmland, so you have pipes several feet underground to lower the groundwater table, which dries it out so you can drive a tractor on it. But it also means, kind of like in karst, anything you put on the land can quickly get into that tile drain and comes out as a pipe and goes into a creek or a ditch or a river. Because of an interesting exemption in the Clean Water Act for ag stormwater, none of it is permitted under the Clean Water Act. It is exempt. At least that's how courts have interpreted it. So none of it is restricted or limited in any way, which is partly why Des Moines Water Works sued more than 10 years ago now to try to address it and get some restrictions on it. But that didn't work, hasn't happened. And it is a vector for nitrate to go very quickly from the ground surface into surface water. There are ways to treat it. You can put bioreactors at the end of those before they get to the creek or ditch or whatever. Those are expensive. They require replacement of the treatment media on a regular basis. So still problematic in some ways to have so much tile drainage, and very little of it is treated at this point.
All right, let's thank Mike for being such a valuable resource to us. I would encourage you to go to the council's website. There are many good resources there. I would also encourage you to sign up for those alerts, simply because it's hard for us as individuals to really stay on top of what's happening in the legislature. And at least there's someone there refining it down to a manageable list. Remember that next month we will be here and we will be in this space. Thank you all for your indulgence as we have to jockey for space, but we are assured by our church hosts, who, by the way, are fabulous. And I'm just going to say, those of you who are members of a group, a religious organization, whatever, that have a space like this church provides for us, let's be mindful of the way they manage their waste, their recycling, reusing cloth napkins. You set the standard very high for us, St. Paul's, and we respect the daylights out of you. So thank you. And lastly, let's give our best wishes to our fearless leader, Connie Ryan, and let's thank Kristen for being the one-woman show today. We appreciate you and we miss Connie, so give her our best. Thank you all.